Hey everyone, I've been debating whether or not to share this, but I figured if anyone would get it, it's you guys. What I'm about to tell you still freaks me out when I think about it, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever have a proper explanation for what happened. So let's rewind to about 5 years ago. I was 22, living on my own for the first time, and working a job that required me to commute about 45 minutes each way. Most days I'd listen to music or a podcast during the drive, but this one particular night, well, things took a turn. It was late, probably close to midnight, because I'd stayed late at work to finish a project. The road I took home was one of those long, winding 2-lane highways surrounded by trees on both sides. Hardly anyone used it at night, so it was pitch black, with just the glow of my headlights lighting the way. I remember feeling unusually on edge that night. You know, when you just feel off, like something isn't right. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to being tired. About 20 minutes into the drive, my phone rang. Now, I know you're not supposed to answer calls while driving, but I figured it might be my mom or a friend checking in since it was so late. I glanced at the screen, and here's where things started getting weird. The caller ID just said unknown number. Normally, I'd let those go to voicemail, but something about it made me answer. "Hello," I said. At first, there was silence. Just that weird, faint static you get on old landlines. "Hello," I repeated, louder this time. And then, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, like someone was whispering from far away, but I couldn't make out the words. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The whispering stopped, and for a second, I thought they'd hung up. But then, clear as day, a man's voice said, "Don't go home." I felt my stomach drop. "Who is this? What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound brave, but my hands were shaking. There was no response, just static. I hung up and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat, trying to convince myself it was some kind of prank. But my heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. About 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. I didn't answer this time, but my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The call went to voicemail, and when it was over, I nervously tapped to listen. The message was just breathing. Slow, deliberate, and way too close to the microphone. I nearly swerved off the road, I was so freaked out. At this point, I was considering turning around and staying at a motel for the night, but I was already halfway home. So I took a deep breath, told myself to calm down, and kept driving. That's when I saw it. On the side of the road, just ahead of me, there was a car pulled over. Its hazard lights were blinking, but the car itself was completely dark. No interior lights, no headlights, nothing. As I got closer, I noticed a figure standing next to the car. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie that hid his face. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing my car as I approached. I slowed down, thinking maybe he needed help, but something about him felt wrong. His posture was off, like he was too rigid, and even though it was dark, I could swear he was staring right at me. I don't know why, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep driving. So I did. As I passed him, I tried not to look, but I couldn't help glancing in my rearview mirror. The man had stepped into the middle of the road, watching my car as I drove away. I hit the gas and didn't look back. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, double-checked them, and practically sprinted to my bedroom. I was still shaken up, but I figured I was safe now. Or so I thought. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was another call from the same unknown number. This time, I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail and sat there in bed, clutching my blankets like a kid afraid of the dark. When the voicemail notification popped up, I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I played it, and what I heard still gives me nightmares. It was my own voice, shaky and terrified, saying, "Who is this? What do you mean?" It was the exact thing I'd said earlier on the call. But here's the thing. I hadn't recorded it. I didn't even have voicemail enabled to save messages like that. I deleted the message immediately and spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with every light in the apartment on. The calls stopped after that, and I never saw the man on the road again. But to this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a prank? Some elaborate setup by someone who knew my route home? Or was it something else entirely? I don't know, but one thing's for sure. I'll never ignore that gut feeling again. This happened 3 years ago when I decided to go on a solo road trip. I'd been dealing with a lot. Work stress, personal drama, you name it. And I thought a few days alone with nothing but the open road and nature might clear my head. I planned the trip meticulously. I'd hit some scenic spots, camp out a bit, and just enjoy the peace. I was excited about it until the third night. That's when everything went sideways. I was driving through a remote area, heading to a campsite I'd found online. The sun had already set, and I was about 30 minutes away from the site. The road was one of those narrow, winding ones, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. No street lights, no other cars, just my headlights cutting through the dark. At first, it was peaceful, the kind of silence that feels comforting. But then I noticed something strange. Up ahead, on the side of the road, was a figure. I couldn't see much at first, just the outline of a person standing still, facing the trees. As I got closer, my stomach did this weird flip. Something about them felt off. They were wearing a long, tattered coat, and their hair was matted, sticking out in all directions. I slowed down, partly out of curiosity and partly because my instincts were screaming at me not to stop. As I drove past, I glanced at them, trying to get a better look. That's when they turned their head, slowly, and locked eyes with me. Their face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. And the grin, oh God, the grin, stretched so wide it didn't look human. I slammed on the gas and sped past them, my heart racing. I told myself it was probably just some eccentric hiker or someone messing around. But then, in my rearview mirror, I saw them step into the road. They weren't running or chasing me. They were just standing there, watching as my car disappeared into the distance. I shook it off, telling myself I was overreacting. I mean, weird people exist, right? No big deal. When I finally got to the campsite, it was pitch black. The site was remote, just a clearing in the woods with a single fire pit. I parked my car, set up my tent, and tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But as I was unpacking, I heard it. A branch snapped, somewhere in the trees behind me. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear anything else. For a while, there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was just an animal. But then came the laughter. It was quiet at first, barely audible, like it was carried on the wind. But it got louder, closer. It wasn't normal laughter. It was high-pitched, almost childlike, but wrong. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. Just darkness and shadows. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, gripping the flashlight so hard my hands started to ache. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, nerves from earlier playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew better. I decided to stay in the car that night. I figured if something or someone was out there, I'd feel safer with locked doors between us. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and tried to relax. For a while, everything was quiet. I even started to doze off. Then I woke up. It took me a second to realize why. Something had tapped on the window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and scanned the area outside. Nothing. Just darkness. Then another tap. It came from the passenger side this time. I turned, and my blood went cold. There, pressed against the glass, was the face of the figure I'd seen on the road. That same pale skin, those hollow eyes, that impossibly wide grin. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared at me, grinning. I scrambled to start the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I hit the gas and tore out of there, not even bothering to take down my tent. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were standing in the middle of the clearing, their head tilted slightly, watching me leave. I drove all night, not stopping until I was miles away, in the safety of a well-lit gas station. I never went back for my tent. I didn't care. To this day, I don't know who or what that was, but I'll never forget that face, and I'll never camp alone again. Hey everyone. What I'm about to share with you is something I've never been able to forget. It happened a few years ago, but honestly, it feels like yesterday. Every time I think about it, my stomach knots up, and I feel that same cold dread I felt that night. Let me set the scene. I was house-sitting for a family friend, Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher. They had this beautiful but slightly eerie old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that creaks even when no one is moving, and at night it feels like the darkness seeps into every corner. I was staying there for a week to look after their dog, Max, while they went on vacation. Max was a big, friendly golden retriever, and honestly, he was one of the only reasons I agreed to take the gig. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I'd feed Max, watch TV, and lock up before heading to bed. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that almost makes you feel like you're being watched. But I chalked it up to the place being so isolated and didn't think much of it. Then came the third night. It was late, maybe around 11:30. I was curled up on the couch with Max lying at my feet, half asleep when I heard a knock at the front door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate knock. I froze. Who comes knocking at a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere that late at night? Max lifted his head, ears perked up. He wasn't barking, which I took as a good sign, but something about the way he stared at the door made my skin crawl. He was tense, like he was waiting for something. I walked over to the door, keeping the chain lock on as I cracked it open just a bit. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. I looked out, but there was no one there. The porch light cast long shadows over the yard, but it was empty. I shut the door and locked it, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was a prank or just the wind knocking something against the door. That's what I told myself. But then, about 10 minutes later, it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it through the front window to see if I could spot anyone. Nothing. The yard was empty, and the gravel driveway was still undisturbed. I locked every door and window, double-checking everything before going back to the couch. Max was still watching the door, his ears flat against his head now. That's when I noticed he was trembling. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. My heart was racing so fast I could barely think straight. I grabbed Max's leash, my phone, and a kitchen knife, and I backed into the living room. I called out, "Who's there? I'm calling the police." No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a second, everything was silent. Then came the knock, this time at the back door. I spun around, nearly dropping the knife. My hands were shaking as I edged closer to the back door. I couldn't see anything through the small frosted glass window, but I could feel someone was there. Max started growling, low and guttural, a sound I'd never heard from him before. "Whoever you are, get out of here," I shouted, my voice cracking, and then I heard it. A voice, muffled but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Let me in." It wasn't a yell or a demand. It was calm, almost pleading. I backed away, dragging Max with me. My brain was screaming at me to get out of the house, but I couldn't move. It was like my legs were glued to the floor. I called 911, trying to explain what was happening while keeping my eyes on the door. The operator told me to stay on the line and that a patrol car was on the way. But before I could respond, Max started barking like crazy, lunging toward the back window. I turned to see what he was barking at, and that's when I saw it. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. It was pale, almost gray, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide grin, teeth too sharp, too white. The face didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared at me. I stumbled back, dropping the knife in my panic. Max was going berserk, barking and growling, but the face didn't react. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't wait for the police. I grabbed Max and bolted for my car, not even bothering to grab my bag or lock the house. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. When the police arrived at the house, they didn't find anyone. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. But here's the thing, the back door. It was unlocked. I know I locked it. I double-checked. I never went back to that house. I told the Fletchers what happened, but they just laughed it off, saying it was probably a drifter or my imagination. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night, I still hear that knock in my dream.